In Breakout Group 4, we were looking at what are the main priorities for sustainable agriculture and how should they be balanced. So we came up with a list of important characteristics that a sustainable agricultural system would have, including a healthy ecosystem. Here we mean an agro-ecosystem, but also healthy ecosystems beyond agriculture. Healthy diets, economic security, social inclusion, climate change resilience of both agriculture and ecosystems, and human well-being. We felt that it wasn't for us to say which of those are more important, and indeed different nations might have different opinions on what was most important for them. But we did agree that the sustainable agriculture should have the constraint of reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by preferably 2030. Otherwise, many of the other goals in that list would be compromised by climate change. Overall, we considered that it would be very important to minimize negative externalities and maximize positive ones. So then we started to get derailed into thinking about policies, and we noted that barriers to implementation or creation of such a sustainable world. And then we noticed that actually there were other breakout groups addressing these barriers and policy questions. But we found it really difficult to actually discuss what we wanted the sustainable agricultural system to look like without thinking about the policies that will get you there and the barriers. We kept coming back to what was realistic. One of the ideas that we came up with that we thought might be helpful in envisioning what such a future world could look like was to actually look at land use allocation globally, and in particular in view of Andrew Barnesford's work on land sparing, and actually the work that we're doing at the Tyndall Centre on where the climate refugia are for biodiversity in the future. So how to protect biodiversity given climate change. And also, of course, Nathan's work on what about where is agriculture going to have to move under climate change. This all requires carefully thinking about where are you going to put agriculture in the future, where are you going to put protected areas in the future, in a climate changed world. Even if it's only changed by 1.5 degrees, you still need to consider that. We've seen already how agricultural cropping has been moving in the US. So we thought that looking at an analysis of, as it were, an optimal land allocation would be very useful in order to help decide what these priorities are. And we acknowledge that obviously those priorities might be very different in different regions of the world, in different countries, and also spatially. And then, of course, it was recognized that, well, that's a very academic exercise that we just talked about, and actually that we need to look at the social feasibility of implementing such guidance on how the best ways to use land. And it was felt that there needed to be a global understanding of this system to help then countries come up with their own plans for how to best use land in their own countries. And in particular, we discussed the difference between, for example, countries in Africa and countries in the developed world, and how actually the way in which farmers receive money and subsidies is very, very different between, say, the US and Africa. And the issue of trade came up, and the issue of fair trade or not in Africa. So, as we've heard earlier in today's meeting, all of these questions are interlinked, and it's very difficult to separate them out. But I think, what we felt was that research into the social science of what is feasible in trying to reach such a more desirable map of global land use is essential. And that has to respect the cultural issues in different countries, and it also has to respect gender issues. So coming back to the African example, so educating women and providing them opportunities to grow sustainable businesses will be very helpful. And also the need for due diligence on sustainable production. So essentially, we came up with a couple of ideas for research, one in the natural science and one in the social sciences, which probably should be paired together rather than done independently to try to help look at how could we actually make the system more sustainable. And one other thing that came up was it was in view of the strong need to look for synergies between carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation and sustainable agriculture, was that there needs to be greater link between with the IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So we've talked a lot about the work of the IPCC in this meeting, but we also felt that the community should also link with the work of IPBES. So it was a very wide-ranging discussion, so if any members would like to bring the room's attention to something I've omitted, please do so.
Thank you very much, Rachel. A question from Dave?
I have a question. I would love us to reach zero greenhouse gas by 2030 for agriculture. The only way I can imagine us doing it is basically, you look at the components of it, the nitrogen
Right. Right. Well, I think the question of what date to put there was very, very briefly discussed, and we didn't look at it in detail. But yes, I had originally said 2050, and then somebody said we should do it by 2030. So that's why that appeared there. But yes, indeed, that is extremely challenging and possibly impossible. But
I think impossible is the right word.
I think it depends on what is the boundary of your system. If we're saying shrinkage in land footprint of food production and then reforestation, afforestation, then maybe it's possible.
You have to change the whole diet of the world in 10 years.
No, yeah. No, you're right. It's not possible. I mean, it's difficult, but
and yet increase yields.
Yeah. No, you're right. We have done similar modeling before, and it was really difficult even by 2050. I'm just saying that it does also depend on whether we then still mean, is it still agriculture once it becomes not agriculture? If that makes sense. Yeah.
well, why don't we change that to 2050 for the records of this meeting? Yeah.
Okay. Right, answer another question.
I think that's what I wanted to suggest. Most industries have accepted 2050.
Yeah.
That's
that was our starting point. I'm not sure who it was that suggested 2030, but anyway.
Thank you, Rachel.